Hello everybody, it is Professor Parish, and we are officially done with fiction and short stories. Crazy, it's only taken us 6 weeks to get here. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and touch base on what is left for week 5. As I'm recording this, we are concluding week 5, and then I'm going to dive into what we're going to be doing for week 6. So just some housekeeping. I'm going to go here to the course content page and show you all. Just really briefly, I've talked about this in some of my other courses, but when you go to course content, you'll see this little gray box here, and I may have touched on this before, but you'll note that it lists 2 assignments that are due by Sunday night. The thing about this little box is that it only ever shows 2 assignments, which is not all of the assignments we sometimes have in this class. So you definitely need to make sure that you scroll down, like for here to week 5, and you'll notice we actually have 3 assignments. The discussion forum is not listed up here. So definitely make sure you don't forget about that. I would definitely scroll through course content and check everything that's due just to make sure you're not forgetting anything. But your fiction exam, your discussion forum, and the final draft of paper 1 are going to be due by this Sunday night. And then I've already read some of your papers. Those of you that have submitted early, thank you. That helps me out a lot in grading. And I'm going to be working the early part of this week to make sure that I get all of the other papers graded and to give you feedback. So please bear with me. This is not the only class that I teach, so it does take me a while to get through grading at times. So just please be patient with me on that. But you do get to revise paper 1. That is a plus that happens with this class, so yay. You will likely notice, let me see, okay. So paper number 1, if you scroll on down here, you'll notice that you have the option to revise by Monday, October 7th at 11:55 p.m., meaning that when you get your paper number 1 back, you can revise your paper and get a higher grade if you want, and you can do that by October 7th. I may have emailed some of you September 29th on accident, so just ignore that, and if you're watching this video, you will know that it's actually the 7th. So I'll be able to tell how many of you actually watch this. If I've emailed you September 29th, but you watch this video and you see it's actually October 7th. So what we do for revisions is you just make changes to what I have proposed in your papers, and then you can email me your revisions for that paper. I would go ahead and put in your subject line paper number 1 revisions and put English 122, either section O or section 02, whichever section you are currently in, because that helps me to find your paper in the grade book a lot faster. Now, some of you may be asking, how do I revise my paper? So I've pulled up this example. This was our example paper number 1. When you get your paper back from me, you will likely see it with some grading errors. So for example, if I, let's say I deleted that and added a comment. Okay. So when you get your paper back, for one, you need to open it up in Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word is going to be the program that's going to allow you to see your edits. So if you don't have Microsoft Word, you can download it for free through your Falcon Mail, and you can that will allow you to have words so that you can edit your papers. If you're not sure how to get it downloaded from your Falcon Mail, you can go to our online orientation, you can contact the Learning Commons, or you can go by the Learning Commons and say, hey, how do I download Microsoft Word? It's pretty easy to do. So when you open your paper up in Word, you're going to see this red line right here. If you see any red lines, that means that there is an edit that I have made to the paper. So if I click on that red line, now you can tell it's turned gray, and I have 2 errors that have come up. One is a comment, and one is where I've deleted text. Here's what you do to revise. First, you need to get rid of all of the comments if there are any. So what you do is you go to the comment, you right-click on it, and you'll see this option that says delete comment. That's what you want to do. So you can delete comment, and as you can see, it is no longer there. Now, this gray line is still here, meaning that I've still got an error somewhere in the paper, and it will be in red. So if you ever see a gray or red line out to the side, it means there's still an edit that you need to take care of. So I find the edit here, and I can right-click on it. And notice I have two options here. I can accept the deletion or reject it. If I reject it, that means it's going to go back to the way it was. I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's an edit that I've made, meaning that it should be corrected. I've had some students be like, no, you're wrong, I'm going to leave it. And I'm like, fair enough, but you're not going to get the point back. So what you want to do is just do accept deletion. And you can see two things have happened. One, your deletion has been accepted, so the alteration has been made. And two, now that line has disappeared, meaning that you've revised that part. So what you do is just go throughout your paper, and anytime you see any red lines or comments, you can right-click on them, delete the comments, and accept the changes made to the paper. And that's pretty much it. As far as revising grammar goes, that's all you have to do to raise your grade. It's pretty easy. Now, if I've noted in your paper that it's not long enough, or that you need to add content or change something, then yes, you do need to actually physically go into your paper and add things to it. But if it's just a grammar revision that you need to make, these are easy. And my hope is that these grammar revisions, you'll be able to notice them, and then when you actually write, they'll become less and less because you're like, oh yeah, I remember when I had to correct that. I shouldn't do that. That's the idea. So we'll actually see if that holds true in future papers. But that's going to be how to revise your paper number 1. And then you can just email me the revisions. And some of you have even already done that since I've graded your paper this week. Thank you. You're making my job easy. And it shows that you're responsible and really upfront about you wanting to get the revision, which is great. You can revise the paper as many times as you like before the deadline. So before October 7th, if you turn it back in and you make revisions and let's say you get a 95 and you really want to push for that 100%, yeah, you can revise it again. I'm totally okay with that, but if you're happy with an A, then we're good. I really recommend revising if you get an 80 or less. I think if you get higher than an 80% on this paper, you're going to be fine, but I've had some students that really just want a 100% on everything, and they are very gung-ho about it, and I'm all for it if you're passionate about it. Whatever works for you. So that's finishing up week 5. Week 6, we are actually starting poetry. Yay! I feel like students either really, really enjoy poetry or they are terrified of it. And I can understand that because poetry can be scary. It can be very difficult and in terms of engagement and understanding and writing and creating. So we're going to go over the very first chapter in our Discovering Literature textbook. Chapter 12 is our poetry preview. It runs from page 611 to 650, although most of those pages are going to be example poems. So don't worry, you're not going to have to read 40 pages worth of text. The terminology is pretty concise. And then if you do want to go ahead, look at Thinking Critically in our Cengage handbook, pages 64 to 74, because I think the thinking critically part is going to kind of come into play when we talk about poetry. And then the only 2 assignments due this week, one is our week 6 discussion forum, which if I pull up here is basically starting us in looking at poetry and terminology. So basically I want you to choose 2 poems from chapter 12, define 2 terms from the chapter. These cannot be terms from the fiction or short story unit. They have to be specifically for poetry. And then explain how your poem, how your 2 poems use those terms. And this is definitely more of your opinion. But still, posts are due Friday, responses are due Sunday. But that's assignment 1. And the other assignment is our thesis and topic for paper 2. And I'll talk about paper 2 here in a moment. And I definitely want you to stick around and listen to the paper 2 guidelines because paper 2 is a little different than what we've been doing or what you've probably done in the past. So I want to go over that with you all, okay? But first, let's talk about poetry. So like I said, we're not going to go over this entire slideshow. We're only going to talk about chapter 12, and then I'm going to come back to this slideshow next week in week 7 to finish up chapters 13 through 15. So we're just going to talk about chapter 12 today. So chapter 12 is what we call the voice of poetry. And the very first page on page 611 in your textbook, I love that they use this picture. It's a picture of Michael Jordan, like about to shoot a basketball into the hoop, and it is our face of poetry. And so I asked my English 122 students, why do we have a picture of Michael Jordan representing poetry? Because it seems kind of odd, right? Why is there a basketball player being the face of poetry? Why do that? Because every other chapter that our textbook uses to preview a chapter on whether it be short story, poetry, or drama, it all kind of relates. But the Michael Jordan seems a little out of place. So I ask you, the students, to think about this for a moment. Why would we select Michael Jordan? The big thing to note is the context and the historical significance of our textbook. Our textbook is a little old. This edition currently is from 2003. It's, 16 years ago. It's a little dated. But we have to think of NBA in the 1990s. The NBA in the 1990s had, Michael Jordan was kind of front and center as being the main guy that you thought of when you thought of the NBA in the 1990s for the Chicago Bulls. You thought of him as being this really outspoken and great basketball player that was a very good spokesperson for the NBA. And so it makes sense for our textbook to use him as the face of poetry, because poetry is really language at its best. And I love that our textbook describes it as that line. So we think of Michael Jordan, we think of basketball at its best. And you can have best players that are not Michael Jordan, but Michael Jordan's kind of like the figurehead of the NBA in the 90s. So language at its best is really what poetry is. It's kind of the poster person for literature. And poetry is hard. It's hard to write. It's hard to read and decipher. A lot of times because it has multiple meanings and the authors leave it ambiguous, or they want the audience to get a different meaning out of it. So it can be kind of hard to, decipher and determine what the actual meaning is. So poetry is also different from other genres in that it can come from a confusing experience. So a lot of poets use the genre of poetry as a means of therapy. They use it to write about sad experiences, to write about trauma, to write about, emotions that are really hard to decipher or explain. When short story and fiction isn't really a medium to do so, poetry kind of takes that place. Poetry can be abstract, it can be vague, and you can write a poem just about a millisecond of time, whereas a novel has to have a more linear format and an actual plot. Poetry doesn't have to have that. It just needs to really express emotion and express experience, and do so in a way that uses language in a complex and creative way. So poetry doesn't give facts or data, and it's printed in a very certain way. So it's printed in what we call verse, or specific lines arranged in a certain order. If you've ever seen a poem in your life, you know exactly what this looks like. And chapter 12 starts us off instantly by giving us some examples of that. As far as terminology with poetry goes, we have quite a few that chapter 12 starts out with. The two main types of poems are epics and lyrics. An epic is a long poem with an elevated style, so it's very stylized. There's lots of patterns and different, ways that language is used throughout. Maybe there's some parallelism. It's a very long poem. Whereas a lyric, think of all the songs you hear on the radio that are, 3 to 5 minutes long. Those are lyrics. They're not long poems. They're rather short, and they can follow patterns if they want. But they're just not like an epic. A good example of an epic would be Beowulf. We often think Beowulf is a short story or a novel because it seems like it's written as prose. But in fact, in the original language it's printed in, Beowulf is a poem. It has a grandiose style, it has a very specific pattern, and it has a very elevated format in which it's created that almost reads like fiction at times. So Beowulf definitely is not just a short poem. It's a long, lengthy, elaborate poem, which we would call an epic. Whereas a lyric is just, you hear a song on the radio, that's pretty much it. We've talked about metaphor in the last couple of chapters of short story. An extended metaphor in a poem just extends that throughout. So it's a comparison that happens throughout the poem, and it can be brought up over and over again to different effects. A rhyme is what we probably know as the most popular term in poetry, and that's just the echo effect produced when a poet repeats the same sound as the final syllable of a word. So word, bird, curd. Although those would be classified as half rhymes, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. But there's that erd sound at the end that makes them rhyme. And then a stanza is a set of related lines in a poem. So just a set of lines grouped together, that's a stanza. On page 626, we discuss the use of meter, feet, and iambic feet. So a meter is regulated, free-flowing rhythms of ordinary speech. So how we normally think of when you hear poetry, it often has that like sing-songy quality or its flow. That is meter. And it's different than ordinary speech. It's more regulated and controlled. A foot is when there are two parts of a line of poetry, segments of two parts. So we call them feet because there's two. Iambic is what happens when you stress the last syllable in a foot of poetry. So I want you to go ahead and look at Robert Frost, the example on page 626 there of walking through the woods on a snowy evening. And I like Frost as a good example for poetry because he writes very nature-driven poetry, but his poetry is also very traditional in its style and structure. And I want you to look at those lines in that poem. Whose woods these are, I think I know. Hold on, just let me pull that up. Sorry, I was going to say it, you know, off of memory, but then I'm like, I need to get the book out and actually look through this. So on page 626, the stanza goes, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping there to watch his woods fill up with snow. Now, I read that pretty fast, but you can kind of see that my voice is naturally wanting to kind of fall into a rhythm. Frost is writing this entire verse in iambic feet. So when you actually read it, it starts to create this rhythm. And in the rhythm, the second syllable is stressed. So I always do like the clap method here. So it's like 1, 2, 1, 2, where you give more emphasis on the 1, 2, on the 2, on the second one. So, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So, why would Frost do this? Why would he create a poem with a verse using iambic feet that has this beat of this 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2? Why would he do that? Well, this poem was written in the 1800s, before we had automobiles. So what was the method of travel, not only as poem, but naturally for the reader at the time? It would be on horseback. So when you have that iambic feet and you see that used in the poem, that rhythm starts to actually sound, I'm going to look like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur doing this, but it's going to be like clop, 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 clop. It sounds like hooves in the snow. Like it sounds like horses' hooves traveling through the snow, and that's what Frost is trying to do. He is using this poetry to create a rhythm, to create a sound when you read it out loud that will leave an impression of that atmosphere. That is the power of poetry in this moment. And it's masterful. It shows that Frost is not only in control of the language that he's using, but he's using this language to create an atmosphere, to create a beat, to create a sound that the audience can register, symbolizing not only what the words mean, but creating a symbolic atmosphere to it. And that's crazy, right? That you can use language to have that sort of impact. And we see artists and songwriters using sound even now to do that. And they use it not only to create an effect in their song, but also to give them a signature feel, right? So, I have this example that I like to use to demonstrate flow and meter, and it's very cheesy, but I also grew up in the 90s, so Nelly, if you know, he's a rapper from the 90s from St. Louis, he has a very certain style of rapping, a certain style of flow or the meter that he uses in his work, which rap is just rhythm and poetry. It's just form of poetry. So Todd in the Shadows is this movie reviewer who he basically reviews music, not movies, music, and different artists. And he has a very, very good note about Nelly that I just kind of want to bring up very quickly here. Just to give this video a little bit of context, he's reviewing the song Cruise by Florida Georgia Line. He doesn't like the song, which you would tell very quickly in this video, but he connects the remix and Nelly and talks about the song itself. But here's his little bit about Nelly that I want to show you all.
Anyway, why did Nelly pick this song to guest on? Well, like I said, the subject matter fits, but also, have you ever listened to Nelly's flow? That sing-songy thing he does? Yeah, if you listen, it's just two notes. Two notes, a fourth part, like this. Da, 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 da. And Cruise? When I first saw that bikini top on her, she's popping right out of the South Georgia water. Da 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 da. Two notes, perfect for Nelly.
So yeah, that whole part there is just emphasizing that he has his own way of doing meter and flow in his song. So I just want to show you guys that as just a fun little note. When you think of meter, think of Nelly. Or Robert Frost, you know, whatever, you know, you think you want to gravitate towards. So continuing on with the terminology that we have. Let me get it here. So we have half and slant rhymes, which I talked about earlier just for a second. They're just a pair of words. They don't technically rhyme, but they sound very similar. So for example, bird, B-I-R-D, and word, W-O-R-D, are not technical rhymes, but they do sound extremely similar, so we can consider them a half rhyme or a slant rhyme. Those terms are pretty much synonymous. They basically mean the same thing. Or you could say, now twice and mice. That would rhyme because they're the same format, same pattern. But if I said mice and kite, mice and kite don't technically rhyme, but they have that same ite sound, that I sound, so they technically would fall into the half versus slant rhymes. In our book, Free Verse versus Open Form, these two terms are extremely similar. There's just a little slight difference between them. Free verse means no rules. There are no rules. It barely resembles poetry except for the style of it. It does not have to rhyme. It doesn't have to even look like a poem. Our opening on page 610, that opening little verse paragraph there, that's technically a free verse poem. Honestly, I'm not a free verse fan. I'm more of a traditionalist when it comes to poetry, but I realize that some people like free verse because of how open and expressive it can be, and if that's your style, then go for it. Open form is similar in that it doesn't have to rhyme or have a pattern, but it's open form, meaning the form still resembles a poem. And there are some examples in our book of open form poems that they look like a poem, but they just don't have a rhyme scheme or a pattern to them. And some poets like to use that instead because it still has the poem structure and format. It just doesn't follow the conventions of normal poetry. So our book also outlines how you're supposed to react and read poetry. So definitely give poems a close reading. A lot of times authors will bake lots and lots of meaning and symbolism into just a few words, meaning that there's a lot of impact that they're going for with a minimal use of language. Get your bearings, understand your author. I know in our book they give us little snippets about the authors and poets in our textbook, so you might want to read those before actually reading their poems so that you can know like what era of time are these poets from, what environment or region are they from, have they wrote poetry all their lives, or are they typically playwrights or authors. I mean, Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets, but we know him as a playwright more than we do a poet. So, you know, just understand who your authors are before you read their poems, if you can. And then respond to the poem as a whole. It can be easy to have an instant reaction to the start of a poem, but give it an entire read through before you technically pass judgment on the poem. Get into the spirit of it. Is it a poem to enlighten? Is it a poem to be therapeutic? Is it a poem just to entertain? Shel Silverstein's one of my favorite poets, and his whole series of poetry were about entertaining but also teaching their audience. So understand that. And then be ready for a personal response. Poetry is often created to elicit a response. Rachel McKibbins is one of my favorite poets. She writes some really dark stuff, like really traumatic, dark poetry, but it's written from a place of experience and depth. And even if you've not gone through those same events that she has, there's parts of her poetry that you can instantly relate to. And it elicits this personal, visceral response whenever I read her work. I really like that. And then finally, vignettes versus haiku. I had a student a few semesters ago that absolutely hated haikus and told me how much he hated haikus. And I was sad to inform him that not only did our final exam require him to write a haiku, but so did our poetry exam as well. So he wrote a haiku about hating haikus. And it was great. But haikus and vignettes are very short forms of poetry. A vignette down here is just what we call snapshot poetry. It's just 3 lines, no more than that. It can be less. It does not have to have a rhyme scheme, just a really quick poem. Haikus, on the other hand, have a very specific format. They are 3 lines, and each line has a certain number of syllables. So the syllable pattern goes 5, 7, 5. So for example, here's my haiku. Class is almost done. 5. Can you hear spring calling now? 7. Wish class was over. 5. So that 5, 7, 5, 3-line format is what you always need to do for a haiku. But I think that they're fun because they're challenging. They make you really think about what words you're going to pick to fit that pattern and make a cohesive, fun haiku. So I really like writing them, and I would encourage you, if you want practice writing poetry, practice by haikus. They're a lot of fun. All right, so that's where we're going to stop today in terms of our PowerPoint. And then for week 7, we'll finish up chapters 13, 14, and 15, the other slides on this PowerPoint. So the final thing I want to talk to you all about are our paper 2 guidelines. So let me go back to this and show you all the guidelines for paper 2. They're in our resources and handouts. We'll scroll down here to week 6. All right, as I said before, paper 2 offers a lot of options. And with those options, come lots of choices to make. So paper 2, we are talking about poetry. And there is a certain amount of creative writing you will do for this paper because this is not a creative writing class, so I'm not going to be judging you on your skill as a writer creatively, but I am going to judge you on your skills in taking what we've learned from poetry and applying it to your work. So option 1 is to choose 2 poems from our textbook to compare and contrast. So you need to talk about these 2 poems. How are they similar? How are they different? And you can use terminology from our poetry unit to describe them. So you can talk about each of their patterns, you can talk about how they use meter, if there's any specific terms from our unit that each poem uses, you can break that down as well. And then at the end, I want you to create a very short sample poem of your own that mimics either one of the poets or both of them. So if you choose Robert Frost and Edgar Allan Poe to compare and contrast, then your poem that you create can mimic either Edgar Allan Poe or Robert Frost. Those 2 poets are different enough, I think it would be hard to mimic both, but you can choose which one you like best to mimic in your own poem. All right, that's option 1. Analyze 2 poems, compare and contrast them, and then create a very short poem of your own, only 1 or 2 verses, 1 or 2 stanzas. That's it, that's all that's required. And then using the elements that you talk about in your paper. I'm going to skip ahead to option 3. Option 3 is exactly the same as option 1, except you're using songs instead of poems. So if there's 2 songs you like, you're going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to be comparing and contrasting those 2 songs, what elements of poetry they use, and then create a few short verses of your own song that mimics one or two. So you could choose like Learn to Fly by Foo Fighters and Other Side by Red Hot Chili Peppers, compare and contrast both of them, and then if you want to create your own little short song, you could mimic, you know, one or two, either one of those artists or both. All right. So that's options 1 and 3. Option 2 is our most creative writing of the creative writing options. And that is you're going to choose 2 pictures or photographs and create a poem for each of those pictures that you picked. And then you're going to compare and contrast the poems you created. Okay? So you could choose a picture of your dog and a picture of a concert you went to, write a poem for each of those pictures, and then compare and contrast your 2 poems and talk about the decisions that you made as a writer, which of the 2 poems of yours you like best, and you know what terminology each of those poems uses. So I highly suggest if you choose option 2, use your own photos, because if you use your own photos, you don't have to cite them in MLA. If you do use photos from Google or another source, you will have to cite those images. So if you want to make it easy on yourself, just choose your own photographs. Okay? So as far as page length, your poems that you create should be a couple of stanzas or a couple of verses. They'll end up looking about half a page. And then your paper itself, your analysis, is at least 2 pages long, 2 full pages. So this paper is a little bit shorter than the last one. You can go over. It's a minimum of 2 pages or more. But your poems are going to make up the rest of that. All right. 12-point font. They should not, the text for your actual poems, you can do whatever you want. You can format your poems however you want. You can use whatever font size, whatever style you want. You can make it colorful, whatever you want to do. You can go crazy with the poems themselves. The analysis part, I do want 12-point font, and I want it to be like legible and font that's not too bold or not too large. So no Verdanda, no Arial bold or Arial, you know, wide. Choose a decent 12-point font. Margins stay the same. The poems should be on their own page. The grammar and spelling should adhere to standard American English. And then you only need a works cited page if you are citing song lyrics from a website or a video. If you choose options 1 or 3, you will need to cite where your poems or your songs come from. And then if you choose option 2 and you don't use your own images, you need to cite where those images come from. But above all, your textbook should be cited for this paper. So this is our first dabble into MLA. You should be citing your textbook, and in the future coming weeks, I'm going to go over how to do this. And then everything's due on time for full credit. And I've got the dates below listed for when things are due, and then how the paper is broken up. So this is the first time our introduction and conclusion will have points devoted to it. The elements you describe, so the terminology from our poetry unit, will count as certain points. Creativity and effort, this is your poems that you create, and I'm judging those based on, do they make sense? Do they properly imitate one of the poets that you're talking about? Or do they show creativity in that you've actually, you know, put in some effort and time into them? And then your grammar and formatting count as well. So if you have questions about our paper, I have included an example in week 7. I've included an example paper. I'll go ahead and open it up for you all, but I will bring this up next week. As you'll notice, this student chose to do option 1. So they basically go through and talk about option 1 and their 2 poems, and then at the end you'll notice after their conclusion they have their own little short poem right here, and then they have a works cited where they cite the book. So it's pretty straightforward if you want to check that out. This is a good example of our paper number 2. They did a really good job on it, so if you want to check it out, definitely do so. But otherwise, that's it for week 6. I'm excited to delve into poetry. I think it's a lot of fun. It's going to be challenging, but it's also going to be exciting too, because a lot of you may have not wrote poetry before, and I think that's going to be a fun thing to dive into. So, as always, if you have questions, please let me know. But in the meantime, I will be grading your paper number 1 and get you that feedback as soon as I can. All right. Have a great week, everybody, and I'll talk to you all soon.